A billionaire businessman found a black maid rejected because of the color of her skin. He saw her as perfect, but when she discovered hidden documents, the devastating truth came to light. The land he offered her had once belonged to her family, stolen decades ago. Past secrets, unexplained deaths, and an impossible partnership changed their lives forever, in ways no one could have imagined. A story of redemption, justice, and the courage to face the truth. Get ready, because this story will deeply touch your heart. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. She held her apron like someone holding a shield, trying to hide her trembling hands before the elegant crowd gathering in the main lobby. The hall, illuminated by crystal chandeliers, seemed like a distant world she would never belong to. But at that moment, all eyes were on her, and not because of the impeccable dedication with which she polished the mirrors or the silent precision with which she set the breakfast table. It was for another reason, a reason she would never dare to speak aloud. The color of her skin. For years, she had served invisibly, faithful, punctual, polite, always discreet, always respectful. She was known for her good manners, for her orange-scented cakes, and for the gentle way she treated her employer's children as if they were her own. But a single rumor was enough to change everything. A malicious comment, whispered during afternoon tea, and she went from being the trusted employee to becoming the silent problem that needed to be removed. There was no discussion. There was no right to reply. There was only a cold dismissal letter and a suitcase left at the back gate. Grace Washington left without raising her voice, but not without direction. During the nights that followed, she slept on station benches, clutching a notebook. The same one where she had written, for years, reflections, recipes, and thoughts that no one had ever read. The paper was old, but the words were alive. It was with this notebook that she wrote, in her own hand, a simple but sincere letter of introduction, and sent it to a philanthropic correspondence foundation, an institution that promoted meetings between working women and lonely gentlemen from the countryside, interested in companionship, friendship, or something more. She hesitated, but she wrote, and she waited. 2 months later, the response arrived. A golden envelope, sealed with an almost illegible inscription, United Estates and Eastern Investments. Inside, an invitation. A man who introduced himself only as E.L. had read her letter and seemed deeply moved. He did not speak of appearance. He spoke of resilience, values, and sensitivity. He offered a meeting, not a contract. But even so, she doubted. Until an elderly lady with whom she shared a boarding house room told her, "Maybe this is your chance to be seen." The place she traveled to was a city that breathed ancient traditions. The women wore starched linen dresses, the men spoke quietly in historic cafes, and any novelty was considered a threat. Upon arriving at the bus station, the first thing she felt was the strong smell of lavender mixed with damp earth. The second was the contemptuous eyes of people seeing her walking with a worn suitcase and dark skin reflected in the shop windows. But it was in the entrance hall of Hope Farm, a name chosen by destiny's irony, that everything changed. The man waiting for her was not a bored old man, but a billionaire businessman who had left the business world recently after a personal tragedy and decided to return to his agricultural roots. He was reserved, polite, and cold. And upon seeing her, he showed neither surprise nor discomfort. He simply said, "You arrived punctually, Miss Washington. I appreciate that." The cohabitation began with clear rules. She would have lodging for 2 weeks, and at the end, both would decide whether to continue the contact. He offered her a room overlooking the orchard. She offered silence and respect. But the farm employees, many of them longtime residents of the city, did not accept her presence well. She was watched, tested, provoked. One of the cooks spread the rumor that she was not who she claimed to be. Another insinuated that she was there out of self-interest. She endured all this in silence, until one late afternoon, the businessman entered the kitchen and found the new guest crying silently while washing fruit. At that moment, something changed in him. For the first time since losing his family, he saw someone whose pain was not theatrical, but genuine. He said nothing. He simply began inviting her for small walks through the fields, asking her opinion about forgotten books in the library, and even requesting her recipes for dinner. Grace had never imagined that her simple words in a letter could lead to this. The man who had responded to her, Edmund Lancaster, was nothing like what she had expected. The newspapers in the distant cities spoke of him as a ruthless businessman, someone who built empires and destroyed competitors without blinking. But here, in this place that smelled of fresh earth and old wood, he seemed like someone trying to remember who he was before success consumed everything he held dear. The first week passed like a cautious dance. She woke before dawn, helped in the kitchen even though she was technically a guest, and spent the afternoons reading in the small library that overlooked the cotton fields. He worked on his papers, made phone calls that echoed through the corridors, and seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders. They exchanged few words, but she noticed how he looked at the family photos on the mantelpiece, with an expression she knew well, the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered. It was on a Thursday evening that she discovered the first secret. While organizing some books that had fallen from a shelf, she found a leather journal hidden behind a volume of poetry. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and the words seemed to flow like music. The owner of the journal wrote about loneliness, about the difficulty of being understood, about the feeling of living in a world that insisted on seeing only the surface of things. Grace felt her heart race. Those words could have been hers. The journal belonged to Edmund's late wife, Margaret. She had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, along with their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. Grace closed the journal immediately, feeling like an intruder, but she could not forget what she had read. That woman, who had lived in luxury and comfort, felt the same spiritual loneliness that Grace had known all her life. That night, for the first time since arriving at the farm, Grace knocked on Edmund's office door. He was seated behind an imposing wooden desk, surrounded by financial documents, but his eyes seemed lost somewhere far away. "Mr. Lancaster," she said softly, "I found something that belongs to you." When she handed him Margaret's journal, she saw something break in his expression. He held the small book as if it were made of glass, and for a moment, she thought he might ask her to leave. Instead, he looked at her with eyes that seemed to see her for the first time. "Did you read it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a few lines," Grace admitted. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy." Edmund was silent for a long moment, turning the journal in his hands. Then he said something that surprised her. "Margaret always said that loneliness was the most democratic feeling in the world. That it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, black or white. Everyone knew what it was like to feel invisible." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. She was wise. "She was everything I wasn't," Edmund replied. "Kind, patient, capable of seeing beauty where others saw only problems." He looked directly at Grace. "She would have liked you." That night marked the beginning of a friendship neither of them had expected. Edmund began asking Grace to join him for dinner, not as an obligation of hospitality, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company. She spoke about books with a passion that reminded him of Margaret, but her perspective was different, marked by experiences he could never fully understand. Grace talked about how she learned to read by candlelight, using newspapers she found in the garbage, how she memorized entire recipes just by watching other cooks, because she was never allowed to write them down, how she developed her own philosophy of life, based on the belief that every person carried something beautiful inside, even when the world insisted on not seeing it. Edmund, in turn, shared stories about his childhood on the farm, before money and success transformed him into someone he sometimes didn't recognize. He talked about how he and Margaret met at a charity event, how she convinced him that true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in the positive impact one could have on others' lives. But it was the farm staff who reminded Grace daily that she was not welcome there. Martha, the head cook, made it clear that she didn't approve of Grace's presence. "In my day," she would say loudly, knowing Grace could hear, "people knew their place." Thomas, the stable overseer, never spoke to Grace directly, but made sure she felt his disapproving gaze whenever she passed by. The situation became even more tense when Grace began helping with farm tasks without being asked. She organized Edmund's paperwork with an efficiency that impressed him, created new recipes that the visiting workers praised, and even helped solve a problem with the orchard irrigation system using knowledge she had acquired from books. One afternoon, while Grace was in the garden picking herbs for dinner, she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. Martha was talking to Thomas near the tool shed, and their words carried clearly on the wind. "She's getting too comfortable," Martha was saying. "Mr. Edmund is a lonely man, vulnerable since the accident. She knows exactly what she's doing." "It's obvious," Thomas replied. "A woman like her doesn't get this far without knowing how to manipulate men. Mark my words, she'll be asking for money soon." Grace felt her knees weaken. Those were the same accusations she had heard before, in the house where she had worked for 7 years before everything fell apart. History seemed to be repeating itself, and she didn't know if she had the strength to face it again. That night, Edmund found her crying in the kitchen, exactly as had happened the first time. But this time, he didn't just offer silent comfort. He sat beside her and asked what was wrong. Grace hesitated. She had learned never to complain, never to create conflicts. But there was something in Edmund's eyes that made her believe he would truly listen. "Mr. Lancaster," she began, her voice shaking. "Maybe it would be better if I left earlier than planned." "Why?" he asked, and she could hear genuine concern in his voice. Grace told him what she had heard, but without naming names. She simply said that some people thought she had ulterior motives, that her presence was causing discomfort. Edmund was silent for a long moment, and Grace feared she had made a mistake in being so direct. But then he did something that surprised her. He smiled, but it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just understood something important. "Grace," he said, using her first name for the first time, "do you know why I really invited you here?" She shook her head. "Because, in your letter, you didn't ask for anything. You didn't promise anything. You just shared who you were, honestly and without pretense. In a world where everyone wants something from me, you were the first person in years to offer something without expecting anything in return." He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the moonlit fields. "Margaret used to say that you could judge a person's character by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. The people who are criticizing you now have never applied that test to themselves." Edmund turned back to Grace. "I'm asking you to stay, not as a guest, but as someone I consider a friend. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can discuss it with me directly." The next morning, Edmund gathered all the farm staff in the main hall. Grace was not present, but she could hear everything from the kitchen where she was preparing coffee. "I want to make something very clear," Edmund's voice echoed through the house. "Miss Washington is my guest, and she will be treated with the same respect you would show any member of my family. Anyone who cannot accept this is free to seek employment elsewhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace heard footsteps, murmurs, and then gradually people dispersing. She knew that Edmund's words would not change everyone's hearts, but at least they established clear boundaries. Later that afternoon, while Grace was reading in the library, she found another surprise that would change everything. Hidden between the pages of an old ledger, she discovered a series of documents dating from the 1940s. They were property deeds, purchase contracts, and correspondence between the previous owners of the farm and the local bank. As she read, Grace's heart began to race. The documents told the story of a black family, the Washingtons, who had owned part of those lands in the 1940s. They had been forced to sell after a series of debts that, according to the papers, had been artificially inflated by discriminatory bank practices. Grace's hands trembled as she read the name on the documents. Samuel Washington, her grandfather. The land where she now stood, the fields she walked through every day, had once belonged to her family. They had been taken through legal manipulation and racial prejudice, and had eventually been sold to Edmund's grandfather at a fraction of their real value. She sat there for hours, holding the papers, trying to process what this meant. The irony was almost unbearable. She had come to this place seeking a new beginning, only to discover that she was returning to land that should never have been taken from her family. When Edmund found her in the library that evening, he immediately knew something was wrong. Grace was sitting in the same position she had been hours earlier, the documents spread on the table before her, tears streaming down her face. "Grace, what happened?" he asked, approaching carefully. She couldn't speak. She simply pointed to the papers. Edmund sat beside her and began reading, and as he did, his expression transformed from confusion to understanding, and finally to something that looked like pain. "My God," he whispered. "Grace, I had no idea. My grandfather," she managed to say through her tears, "used to tell stories about the land he lost. I always thought they were just stories, tales from a bitter old man. I never imagined." Edmund was silent, studying the documents. The evidence was irrefutable. The Washingtons had been victims of a systematic fraud, and the Lancaster family had unknowingly benefited from this injustice for generations. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. Grace looked at him, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "These documents prove that your family has legitimate rights to this land. You could hire lawyers, file a lawsuit. You could reclaim what was stolen." Grace had never considered this possibility. The idea of fighting seemed as foreign to her as flying to the moon. She had been raised to accept, to endure, to make do with what little life offered. "I wouldn't know how," she said honestly. "And even if I did, I don't have money for lawyers." Edmund stood up and walked to the window, the same gesture he made whenever he needed to think. "Grace, what if I told you there was another way?" She looked at him questioningly. "What if, instead of a legal battle, we found a way to right this wrong together? What if we turned this farm into something that honors your family's memory and creates opportunities for people who have been marginalized like you were?" The proposal was so unexpected that Grace could barely comprehend it. "What are you suggesting?" "A partnership," Edmund said, turning to face her. "You would become a co-owner of the farm, not because of my generosity, but because of your family's rightful claim. Together, we could transform this place into something meaningful." Grace stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious. "Mr. Lancaster, you barely know me. Why would you do such a thing?" "Because Margaret was right," he replied. "True wealth is not measured in what we accumulate, but in what we restore. And because for the first time in 3 years, I feel like I'm doing something that makes sense." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She walked through the fields under the starlight, thinking about her grandfather's stories, about the generations of injustice, about the impossibility of what Edmund was proposing. Part of her feared it was too good to be true, that there had to be a catch she couldn't see. But another part of her, the part that had survived years of humiliation and prejudice, whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to believe that good things could happen to people like her too. The next morning, Edmund called his lawyers. The conversation was long and heated, and Grace could hear raised voices coming from the office. When the meeting ended, Edmund emerged, looking tired but determined. "They think I've lost my mind," he told Grace. "But they'll do what I asked. The legal process will be complex, but it's possible." Over the following days, news of the partnership began to spread through the town. The reaction was exactly what Grace had feared. Threatening letters arrived at the farm. Local business owners openly criticized Edmund. Some of the farm staff quit without notice, but there were also surprises. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the only black doctor in the county, came to personally thank Grace. "You don't know what this means," she said, tears in her eyes. "You're opening doors that have been closed for generations." Reverend James Thompson from the local Baptist church offered to help organize community meetings to explain the project. "Change is never easy," he told Grace, "but it's necessary." Even some of Edmund's former business associates began to express support. "I always knew there was something special about Margaret's husband," one of them said during a phone call Grace overheard. "This proves it." But the real test came when Edmund's estranged brother, William Lancaster, arrived at the farm unannounced. William was everything Edmund was trying not to be anymore. Calculating, ambitious, and openly racist. "Have you completely lost your mind, Edmund?" William shouted during a heated argument in the main hall. "You're going to give half of our family's legacy to a complete stranger?" "She's not a stranger," Edmund replied calmly. "She's the granddaughter of the man our grandfather stole this land from." "Allegedly stole," William corrected. "Those documents could be fake, and even if they're not, that was a different time. You can't right every historical wrong." Grace, who was listening from the kitchen, felt her heart sink. Maybe William was right. Maybe she was asking for too much, expecting too much. But then she heard Edmund's voice, firm and clear. "William, I've spent 3 years trying to understand why Margaret and Emma were taken from me. I've looked for meaning in meaningless places. But now I know that their death wasn't meant to destroy me. It was meant to open my eyes to what really matters." "And what matters is this woman?" William asked with disdain. "What matters is justice," Edmund replied. "What matters is using the privilege I inherited to create something better than what came before." William left that same day, promising he would consult lawyers and fight the partnership. But his departure only strengthened Edmund's resolve. That evening, as Grace and Edmund walked through the fields where her grandfather had once worked, she asked the question that had been tormenting her. "Are you sure about this? You could lose everything." Edmund stopped and looked at the land around them. "Grace, I've already lost everything that mattered to me. This gives me a chance to build something new, something that Margaret and Emma would be proud of." He turned to her. "But I need to know that you're really in this. This won't be easy. There will be more resistance, more criticism, more people trying to tear us down." Grace thought about her grandfather's stories, about the generations of her family who had been denied opportunities, about the children who would come after her. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, "I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps were thrown my way. Maybe it's time to stop accepting scraps and start demanding what's right." Edmund smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it was a smile full of hope. "Then we're partners, Miss Washington. Equal partners." As they walked back to the house, Grace felt something she had never experienced before. The sensation of walking on land that belonged to her. Not because someone had been kind enough to welcome her, but because it was her birthright. The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. But she had no idea that the real challenges were just beginning, and that the discovery of those documents was only the first of many secrets that Hope Farm still held. The lawyers arrived on a Tuesday morning that promised rain. Grace watched from the kitchen window as 3 black cars pulled up the gravel driveway, each one carrying men in expensive suits who looked like they had never stepped foot on a farm in their lives. She could feel her stomach knotting with anxiety. These men held the power to make Edmund's proposal a reality, or to destroy it completely. Edmund had warned her that the legal process would be complicated. "There will be contracts, evaluations, historical research," he had explained the night before. "They'll want to verify every document, every claim. They'll question everything." And they did. For 3 days, the lawyers turned the farm upside down. They photographed every document Grace had found, interviewed neighbors who remembered stories from their grandparents, and even brought in a historian specializing in post-war land transactions. Grace felt like a specimen under a microscope, examined and analyzed from every possible angle. The worst part was the questions about her motivation. "Miss Washington," one of the lawyers asked during a particularly uncomfortable interview, "what assurance do we have that you're not orchestrating an elaborate fraud?" The accusation hit Grace like a physical blow. She looked at the man, with his perfectly pressed shirt and gold watch, and realized that no matter how much evidence supported her claim, some people would always see her as someone trying to take what didn't belong to her. "Sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "if I were capable of orchestrating something this elaborate, do you think I would have spent the last 7 years cleaning other people's houses for minimum wage?" Edmund, who was present during the interview, intervened before the lawyer could respond. "Gentlemen, Miss Washington's integrity is not up for debate. If you have concerns about the authenticity of the documents, investigate the documents. But I will not tolerate any more personal attacks." The tension in the room was palpable, but Grace felt a surge of gratitude toward Edmund. He was defending her not because he had to, but because he believed in what they were doing. On the 4th day, the lawyers delivered their verdict. The documents were authentic. Grace's grandfather, Samuel Washington, had indeed been the legitimate owner of approximately 40% of what was now Hope Farm. The transaction that had transferred the land to Edmund's grandfather had been conducted under circumstances that, by today's standards, would be considered fraudulent. However, the lead lawyer continued, implementing this partnership will require navigating numerous legal and tax complications. The process could take months, possibly years. Grace felt her heart sink. Years. She had learned not to trust promises that extended too far into the future. Too many things could change. Too many people could change their minds. But Edmund seemed undeterred. "Then we start immediately," he said. "And in the meantime, Miss Washington will assume full administrative responsibilities for the farm operations, with compensation commensurate with her role as co-owner." That afternoon, as the lawyers packed their briefcases and drove away, Grace found herself alone with Edmund in his office. The magnitude of what was happening was finally beginning to sink in. "Are you sure about this?" she asked for what felt like the 100th time. Edmund looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was the same look he had when he talked about Margaret and Emma, a mixture of determination and pain that suggested he was doing this as much for them as for Grace. "Grace, 3 years ago I lost everything that gave my life meaning. I've been existing, not living, ever since. This partnership, this chance to right a historical wrong, it's the first thing that has made me feel alive again." He stood up and walked to the window, a gesture that had become familiar. "But I need you to understand something. This isn't charity. This isn't me trying to ease my conscience or play the part of the benevolent white savior. This is justice, pure and simple. And it's also incredibly selfish on my part, because I need this as much as you do." Grace studied his profile against the afternoon light. There was something broken in Edmund Lancaster, something that went beyond the loss of his family. She was beginning to understand that he was a man trying to redeem not just himself, but the legacy of his entire family. The next few weeks brought changes that Grace could never have imagined. Edmund insisted that she move from the guest room to the main suite on the 2nd floor, the one with the large windows overlooking the fields her grandfather had once plowed. He introduced her to the bank managers, the agricultural suppliers, and the local government officials as his business partner, watching their faces carefully for any sign of disrespect. Most challenging of all was learning to make decisions as an equal. Grace had spent her entire life taking orders, not giving them. When Edmund asked for her opinion on whether to invest in new irrigation equipment, she initially thought he was testing her. When he deferred to her judgment on hiring new staff, she was convinced he was being polite. It took a conversation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell to help Grace understand what was happening. The doctor had become a regular visitor to the farm, offering both moral support and practical advice on navigating the social dynamics of the community. "Grace," Dr. Mitchell said during one of their walks through the orchard, "you have to stop waiting for permission to take up space. Edmund is treating you as an equal because you are an equal. But you have to believe it yourself before anyone else will." "It's not that simple," Grace replied. "I've spent 43 years being told I'm not good enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough. You can't just flip a switch and change that." "No, you can't," Dr. Mitchell agreed. "But you can start practicing. Every day, in small ways, you can practice believing you belong." That evening, Grace made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She knocked on Edmund's office door, and when he invited her in, she didn't wait to be offered a seat. She sat down across from his desk and looked him directly in the eye. "I want to talk about expanding the farm's operations," she said. Edmund leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm listening. I've been reading the agricultural reports, and I think we're underutilizing the land. We could increase cotton production by 30% if we optimize the planting patterns. And there's a section near the eastern border that would be perfect for a vegetable garden that could supply the local farmers market." For the next hour, Grace outlined her vision for the farm with a confidence that surprised even her. She had charts, calculations, and a detailed timeline. Edmund listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When can we start?" The transformation of Hope Farm began immediately. Grace threw herself into the work with an energy that amazed everyone, including herself. She woke before dawn to check on the crops, spent her afternoons coordinating with suppliers, and her evenings planning for the next day's tasks. But it was the social transformation that proved most challenging. The news of the partnership had spread throughout the county, and reactions were mixed at best. Some people were openly hostile, refusing to do business with the farm. Others were cautiously supportive, curious to see if the experiment would succeed. The real test came when Grace decided to host the farm's first community meeting. She wanted to explain the partnership directly to the neighbors, to address their concerns and hopefully gain their support. Edmund was skeptical. "Grace, these people have been raised on generations of prejudice. You can't change their minds with one meeting." "Maybe not," Grace replied, "but I can give them a chance to see me as more than their assumptions." The meeting was held on a Saturday evening in the farm's main barn. Grace had spent days preparing, researching successful integrated farming operations, gathering statistics on economic benefits of diversity, and practicing her presentation. About 30 people showed up, more than Grace had expected, but fewer than Edmund had hoped for. The crowd was predominantly white, middle-aged, and visibly skeptical. Grace recognized some faces from town, including Martha, the former cook who had quit in protest of the partnership. Grace began by telling her story simply and honestly. She talked about her grandfather's connection to the land, about the injustices that had led to her family's displacement, and about the opportunity they now had to create something positive from a historical wrong. "I'm not here to take anything away from anyone," she said, looking directly at the faces in the crowd. "I'm here to build something that benefits everyone. This farm can be a model for how we move forward together, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it." The questions that followed were sometimes hostile, sometimes genuinely curious. A local farmer wanted to know if the partnership would affect land values. A shop owner was concerned about the farm's economic impact on existing businesses. A young mother asked if the changes would affect her children's school district. Grace answered each question patiently and thoroughly. She had done her homework, and her responses were backed by facts and research. Slowly, she could see some of the suspicion in the room beginning to soften. But it was Martha who asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Miss Washington," she said, standing up with difficulty, her voice carrying a lifetime of ingrained beliefs, "what makes you think you can succeed where others have failed? What makes you think you can bridge differences that have existed for generations?" Grace looked at the woman who had made her life difficult during her first weeks at the farm. She could have responded with anger or defensiveness. Instead, she chose honesty. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, using Martha's last name respectfully, "I don't know if I can succeed. I don't have a guarantee that this will work. What I have is the belief that we can't keep repeating the same patterns and expecting different results." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My grandfather used to tell me that the land doesn't care what color your hands are when you tend it. It only cares that you tend it well. Maybe it's time we learned that lesson." The room was silent for a long moment. Then, to Grace's amazement, Martha nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was acknowledgement. After the meeting, several people approached Grace individually. Some offered tentative support. Others asked more detailed questions about the farm's plans. A few simply shook her hand and wished her luck. But it was a conversation with young Timothy Collins, a recent agricultural college graduate, that would prove most significant. "Miss Washington," he said, "I've been looking for an opportunity to implement some innovative farming techniques. Would you be interested in hearing about sustainable agriculture practices?" That conversation led to Timothy becoming the farm's first new hire under Grace's leadership. It also marked the beginning of Hope Farm's transformation into something neither Grace nor Edmund had originally envisioned. Over the following months, the farm became a testing ground for progressive agricultural techniques. Timothy introduced crop rotation systems that improved soil health. Grace implemented a community-supported agriculture program that connected local families directly with the farm's produce. Edmund used his business connections to secure contracts with organic food distributors in nearby cities. But success brought its own challenges. As the farm's profile grew, so did the scrutiny. A local newspaper ran a series of articles questioning the legitimacy of Grace's claims. A group of neighboring farmers filed a complaint with the county, arguing that the partnership violated local zoning regulations. Most painfully for Grace, her past became fodder for gossip and speculation. Details about her previous employment, her time at the boarding house, even her personal relationships were discussed openly in shops and cafes throughout the town. One particularly difficult morning, Grace found a letter slipped under her door. It was anonymous, but the message was clear. "We know what you really are. Stop pretending to be something you're not. Leave before we make you leave." Grace sat on her bed, holding the letter, feeling the familiar weight of despair settling over her. For a moment, she wondered if everyone was right. Maybe she was reaching too high, trying to be something she wasn't meant to be. But then she heard Margaret's voice, or rather, she imagined what Margaret would have said based on the journal entries she had read. Margaret would have said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. Grace got dressed, went downstairs, and found Edmund in his office. She placed the letter on his desk without saying a word. Edmund read it, his expression growing darker with each word. When he finished, he looked up at Grace. "Do you want to involve the police?" "No," Grace said firmly. "I want to frame it and hang it on the wall." Edmund looked at her questioningly. "Every time I look at it," Grace explained, "I'll remember that someone was so threatened by a black woman succeeding that they felt the need to write an anonymous letter. That tells me I'm doing something right." It was around this time that Grace made a discovery that would change everything once again. While organizing some old files in the basement, she found a box that had apparently been missed during the lawyer's investigation. Inside were more documents related to her family's history, but these were different from the land deeds she had found earlier. Among the papers was a letter from her grandfather to Edmund's grandfather, written just before the forced sale of the land. In it, Samuel Washington proposed a partnership rather than a sale, offering to share both the land and the profits in exchange for keeping his family's farm intact. The letter was dated, signed, and included specific terms that would have been beneficial to both families. But paper-clipped to it was Edmund's grandfather's response, a curt rejection that made it clear he had no interest in working with a black partner, regardless of the financial benefits. Grace read the letters 3 times before the implications fully sank in. Her grandfather hadn't just been cheated out of his land. He had been denied the very type of partnership she and Edmund were now creating. The irony was so profound it took her breath away. But there was more. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small journal that belonged to Samuel Washington himself. Grace opened it with trembling hands and found page after page of her grandfather's thoughts, dreams, and plans for the land. Samuel Washington had been more than just a farmer. He had been a visionary, planning crop rotations, soil conservation techniques, and community programs that were decades ahead of their time. Reading his words, Grace realized that her ideas for the farm weren't just her own. They were the continuation of a dream that had been interrupted by prejudice and injustice. That evening, Grace shared the discovery with Edmund. They sat in the library, surrounded by the documents, reading passages from Samuel's journal aloud. "Listen to this," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. He wrote, "I dream of a day when this land will feed not just my family, but families of all colors. When children will learn together under the shade of these trees, and the harvest will belong to everyone who tends it." Edmund was quiet for a long time after Grace finished reading. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandfather wasn't just wrong, Grace. He was evil. He knew what Samuel was offering, and he chose hatred over partnership. But that was then," Grace said gently. "We can't change what happened, but we can honor what my grandfather dreamed of." Edmund nodded, but Grace could see that the discovery had shaken him profoundly. She was beginning to understand that Edmund's commitment to their partnership wasn't just about making amends, it was about confronting the ugly truth of his family's legacy. The next few weeks brought unexpected visitors to Hope Farm. Dr. Rachel Green, a historian from the State University, came to study the documents and interview Grace about her family's history. Her research revealed that the Washington family's story was not unique. Similar injustices had been perpetrated against black farmers throughout the region during the 1940s and 1950s. "What you're doing here," Dr. Green told Grace and Edmund, "could be a model for addressing historical injustices throughout the South. You're not just restoring one family's land rights, you're demonstrating how to move forward without forgetting the past." But it was a visit from Edmund's estranged daughter, Catherine, that brought the most unexpected revelations. Catherine was 28 years old, a lawyer living in New York, and she hadn't spoken to her father since her mother and sister's funeral 3 years earlier. She arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, driving a rental car and wearing a business suit that looked completely out of place against the farm's rural backdrop. Grace was working in the garden when she saw the car pull up, and she immediately sensed that this visit was going to be significant. Catherine's first words to her father were not a greeting, but an accusation. "Dad, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Grace, who was close enough to hear, decided it was not her place to eavesdrop on a family reunion. But as she tried to retreat to the house, Edmund called out to her, "Grace, please stay. Catherine, I'd like you to meet my partner, Grace Washington." The word partner seemed to hit Catherine like a physical blow. She stared at Grace with undisguised hostility. "This is her? This is the woman you're giving away Mom's inheritance to?" Grace felt her face burn with shame and anger. She had experienced prejudice many times, but it was particularly painful coming from Edmund's own daughter. "Catherine," Edmund said sharply, "you will speak respectfully, or you will leave." "Respectfully?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "Dad, this woman is taking advantage of your grief. Can't you see that?" Grace had heard enough. "Miss Lancaster," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil, "I understand your concern for your father. If I were in your position, I might feel the same way. But I would appreciate it if you would speak to me directly rather than about me." Catherine turned to face Grace fully for the first time. "Fine. What exactly do you want from my father?" "Justice," Grace replied simply. "The same thing your father wants." "Justice." Catherine's voice rose. "You want justice? My father is a grieving widower who hasn't been thinking clearly since my mother and sister died. You're manipulating his guilt and loneliness to steal our family's legacy." Grace felt something snap inside her. For months, she had endured whispers, accusations, and doubt. She had been patient, understanding, and diplomatic. But she was done being accused of manipulation by people who refused to see the truth. "Miss Lancaster," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "your family's legacy was built on theft. Your great-grandfather stole land from my grandfather through legal manipulation and racial prejudice. Your father isn't giving me anything. He's returning what was always mine." Catherine stared at Grace in shock. No one had ever spoken to her so directly, with such conviction. Edmund stepped forward. "Catherine, Grace is right. I've shown you the documents. You've seen the evidence. Our family benefited from an injustice, and now we have the opportunity to make it right." "But what about Emma?" Catherine asked, and for the first time, her voice cracked with emotion. "What about my little sister's memory? This was supposed to be her inheritance." Edmund's expression softened. Grace could see the pain in his eyes, the struggle between his love for his lost daughter and his commitment to justice. "Catherine," he said gently, "Emma would have wanted us to do the right thing. You know that." Catherine began to cry, and Grace felt her anger melting into compassion. This young woman wasn't just defending her inheritance. She was protecting the memory of a sister she had lost. Without thinking, Grace approached Catherine and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Your sister will always be a part of this place," she said softly. "Nothing we do will change that. But maybe she would want this land to be a place where all children can find hope, regardless of what they look like." Catherine looked at Grace through her tears, and for a moment, Grace saw not the hostile lawyer, but a grieving young woman who missed her family. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening. Catherine asked hard questions about the partnership, about Grace's motivations, about the long-term plans for the farm. Grace answered each question honestly, and gradually, Catherine's hostility began to transform into something approaching respect. But it was when Catherine asked to see Emma's room that the real breakthrough occurred. The room had been preserved exactly as it was when Emma died, a shrine to a little girl who would never grow up. Grace had never entered the room before, respecting Edmund's need to keep that space sacred. Catherine led them upstairs and opened the door to reveal a child's bedroom filled with books, stuffed animals, and artwork. On the walls were Emma's drawings, colorful depictions of the farm with stick figure families of various colors working together in the fields. "She drew these after Mom read her a story about ruby bridges," Catherine explained, her voice thick with emotion. "She said she wanted our farm to be a place where everyone could be happy together." Grace stared at the drawings, seeing in them the same vision that her grandfather had written about in his journal. Somehow, an 8-year-old girl had understood what many adults couldn't grasp, that the land was big enough for everyone. Edmund was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. "She knew," he whispered. "Somehow, she knew what we needed to do." That night, Catherine stayed for dinner, and for the first time since her arrival, she addressed Grace by name rather than as "this woman." The conversation was still tense, but it was no longer hostile. "I still have concerns," Catherine admitted as they finished eating. "This is all happening very fast, and there are legal implications that need to be carefully considered." "I agree," Grace said. "I don't want to rush into anything that could harm your father or your family." Catherine studied Grace's face, as if trying to read her sincerity. "Would you be willing to have everything reviewed by an independent legal team? Not Dad's lawyers, but someone completely neutral?" Grace looked at Edmund, who nodded his approval. "Yes," Grace said. "I want this to be done right, in a way that protects everyone involved." For the first time since her arrival, Catherine smiled. "Then maybe we can work together after all." That night, as Grace prepared for bed, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had gone from being an invisible domestic worker to being a landowner, a business partner, and now, potentially, a trusted family friend. But she also knew that the hardest challenges were still ahead. The legal review Catherine had requested would be thorough and potentially devastating. If any irregularities were found, if any aspect of the partnership was deemed improper, she could lose everything. As she looked out her bedroom window at the moonlit fields, Grace whispered a prayer to her grandfather's spirit. "I'm trying to finish what you started," she said to the darkness. "I hope I'm strong enough to see it through." What Grace didn't know was that someone had been listening to her conversations with Edmund and Catherine. Someone who had been documenting every detail of the partnership, every legal document, every plan for the farm's future. Someone who was preparing to use that information in ways that would threaten everything they had built. The real test of their partnership was about to begin. The independent legal team that Catherine had requested arrived 3 weeks later, led by a stern woman named Patricia Holbrook, who had built her reputation on exposing fraudulent land deals. Grace watched from the kitchen window as the team unloaded boxes of equipment, feeling her stomach twist with familiar anxiety. These people could destroy everything she and Edmund had built with a single report. Edmund tried to reassure her. "Grace, we have nothing to hide. The documents are authentic, the partnership is legitimate, and our intentions are honest. That's all that matters." But Grace had learned through painful experience that truth and justice didn't always align. She had been honest and hardworking in her previous job, yet false accusations had still destroyed her life. Now, with so much more at stake, she couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. The investigation lasted 10 days. Ms. Holbrook and her team examined every document, interviewed dozens of people, and scrutinized every aspect of the partnership with microscopic detail. They spoke with former employees, community members, agricultural experts, and even tracked down distant relatives of both the Washington and Lancaster families. Grace tried to continue with her daily routines, but the constant scrutiny made normal life impossible. Every conversation was potentially being recorded, every decision analyzed for ulterior motives. She felt like she was living under a microscope, waiting for someone to find the flaw that would prove she didn't belong. On the 8th day of the investigation, something unexpected happened. Grace was working in the vegetable garden when she noticed a black sedan parked at the edge of the property, just beyond the fence line. The car had been there for several hours, and she could see someone inside with what looked like a camera with a long lens. At first, she thought it might be connected to the legal investigation, but when she mentioned it to Ms. Holbrook, the lawyer seemed genuinely surprised. "That's not one of our people," she said, making a note in her files. "Have you been receiving any media attention?" Grace shook her head. The partnership had been covered in the local newspaper, but nothing that would attract outside attention. The mysterious photographer made her uneasy, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already stressful situation. That evening, Edmund called a family meeting that included Grace, Catherine, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had become an unofficial advisor to their efforts. The purpose was to prepare for Ms. Holbrook's final report, which would be delivered the following day. "Whatever the report says," Edmund began, "I want everyone to know that I have no regrets about what we've done. This partnership has given my life meaning again, and I won't let legal technicalities destroy something that's fundamentally right." Catherine nodded, but Grace could see the worry in her eyes. "Dad, what if they find some procedural error? What if the partnership is deemed invalid? Then we'll find another way," Edmund replied firmly. "Grace's family has a moral claim to this land that exists regardless of legal documentation. We'll honor that claim no matter what the lawyers say." Grace felt a surge of gratitude mixed with fear. Edmund's loyalty was unwavering, but she wondered what it might cost him. She was beginning to understand that their partnership had become about more than land or justice. It had become a symbol of whether people could change, whether healing was possible. The next morning, Ms. Holbrook called everyone into Edmund's office for the final report. Grace sat between Edmund and Catherine, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to prepare herself for disappointment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ms. Holbrook began, "I want to start by saying that this has been one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've ever investigated. The historical evidence supporting Miss Washington's family's claim to this land is overwhelming and indisputable." Grace felt her heart skip a beat. That sounded positive, but she had learned to wait for the "however" that inevitably followed. "However," Ms. Holbrook continued, and Grace's stomach dropped, "there are several irregularities in how this partnership has been structured that require attention." For the next hour, Ms. Holbrook outlined a series of technical legal issues that needed to be addressed. Most were minor procedural matters, but there was one significant concern. The rapid timeline of the partnership could be interpreted as evidence of undue influence or coercion. "Miss Washington," Ms. Holbrook said, looking directly at Grace, "I need to ask you directly. Did Mr. Lancaster pressure you in any way to enter into this partnership? Did he make promises or threats that influenced your decision?" Grace looked at Edmund, whose face had gone pale. She understood that her answer could determine the future of everything they had built. "No," Grace said firmly. "If anything, I pressured him. When I learned about my family's history with this land, I could have hired lawyers and filed a lawsuit. Mr. Lancaster offered me a partnership instead, which was more generous than anything I had a right to expect." Ms. Holbrook made notes and asked several follow-up questions, but Grace could see that her response had been convincing. After another hour of discussion, the lawyer delivered her final verdict. "It is my professional opinion that this partnership, while unusual, is legally sound and ethically appropriate. With some minor adjustments to the documentation, I see no reason why it cannot proceed as planned." Grace felt like she could breathe again for the first time in weeks. Edmund squeezed her hand, and Catherine actually smiled, but their relief was short-lived. As Ms. Holbrook was packing up her materials, Edmund's assistant knocked on the office door with an urgent message. "Mr. Lancaster, there's a reporter here from the Atlanta Constitution. He says he has some questions about your business practices." The color drained from Edmund's face. "What kind of questions?" "He wouldn't say, sir, but he mentioned something about your previous company and civil rights violations." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Edmund's previous company, Lancaster Industries, had been sold 3 years earlier, shortly after Margaret and Emma's death. Edmund had never talked about why he left the business world so abruptly, and Grace had assumed it was simply grief over his family's loss. "Tell him I'm not available," Edmund said, but his voice lacked conviction. The reporter, however, was not easily deterred. Over the next few days, he lingered around the farm, asking questions of employees, neighbors, and anyone else who would talk to him. His presence made everyone nervous, and Grace began to suspect that this was connected to the mysterious photographer she had seen earlier. On Friday evening, the reporter finally cornered Grace as she was returning from the farmer's market. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and a persistent manner that reminded Grace of a hunting dog following a scent. "Miss Washington," he called out, approaching her with a recording device already running. "I'm James Morrison from the Atlanta Constitution. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your partnership with Edmund Lancaster." Grace had been media trained by Dr. Mitchell, who had warned her that this day would eventually come. "I'm happy to discuss our agricultural initiatives," Grace replied carefully. "But I won't comment on Mr. Lancaster's personal matters." "What if I told you that Mr. Lancaster's previous company was involved in systematic discrimination against black employees?" Morrison asked, watching Grace's face carefully for her reaction. "Would that change your opinion of your partnership?" Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I would say that people can change, and that past mistakes don't necessarily define present actions." "But what if it wasn't just employment discrimination?" Morrison pressed. "What if Lancaster Industries was involved in illegal land acquisitions that specifically targeted black farmers? Would you still defend your partner?" Grace's hands began to tremble. She had never heard these accusations before, and she had no idea if they were true. But she could see the gleam in Morrison's eyes, the satisfaction of someone who had found the story he was looking for. "I have no comment," Grace said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. That evening, Grace confronted Edmund directly. She found him in his office, staring out the window at the fields. His shoulders slumped with what looked like defeat. "Edmund," she said, closing the door behind her, "we need to talk about Lancaster Industries." Edmund turned slowly, and Grace was shocked by the anguish in his eyes. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment with dread. "What do you want to know?" he asked quietly. "The truth," Grace replied. "All of it." Edmund was silent for a long moment, then walked to his desk and opened a locked drawer. From it, he withdrew a thick folder that looked like it had been handled many times. "Grace, there are things about my past that I should have told you from the beginning. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would never have agreed to the partnership." He handed her the folder. "Lancaster Industries wasn't just a normal development company. We specialized in acquiring undervalued properties, often in minority communities. The business model was based on identifying properties where the owners were vulnerable to financial pressure." Grace opened the folder and found dozens of documents, property deeds, legal correspondence, and newspaper clippings. As she read, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Lancaster Industries had systematically targeted black and Hispanic property owners using legal technicalities, financial manipulation, and sometimes outright intimidation to force sales at below-market prices. "My God, Edmund," Grace whispered. "How could you have been part of this?" "I told myself I was just running a business," Edmund said, his voice barely audible. "I told myself that what we were doing was legal, that we were helping people who couldn't afford their properties anyway. I was so focused on profits that I refused to see the human cost." Grace continued reading, her horror growing with each document. There were dozens of families, hundreds of properties, millions of dollars in lost wealth transferred from minority communities to wealthy developers. "When did you realize what you were really doing?" Grace asked. "Margaret figured it out first," Edmund replied. "She started asking questions about our business practices, started visiting some of the properties we had acquired. When she saw how our business model was affecting real families, she was devastated." Edmund sat down heavily in his chair. "She threatened to leave me unless I changed the company's practices. We had terrible fights about it. She said I had become someone she didn't recognize, someone she couldn't respect." Grace felt sick to her stomach. "What happened then?" "I promised her I would change everything. I said I would use the company's resources to help the communities we had harmed, that I would find a way to make amends. She believed me, and I think she was starting to forgive me." Edmund's voice broke. "That's when the accident happened." Grace looked up from the documents. "The car accident that killed Margaret and Emma?" Edmund nodded, tears streaming down his face. "They were driving to meet with a family whose farm we had acquired. Margaret wanted to personally apologize and arrange for them to buy back their property. She was trying to help me fix what I had broken." The full horror of the situation was beginning to dawn on Grace. "Edmund, are you saying that Margaret and Emma died because they were trying to right the wrongs your company had committed?" "The police said it was an accident," Edmund replied. "A truck ran a red light and hit them head on. The driver was killed too, so there was no one to question. But Grace, I've always wondered if it was really an accident. Grace stared at him. What do you mean? Some of the families we had displaced were very angry. There had been threats, both to the company and to me personally. I always wondered if someone had targeted Margaret as a way of getting to me. Grace felt like the room was spinning. Everything she thought she knew about Edmund, about their partnership, about the meaning of what they were doing together, was suddenly in question. Grace, Edmund said desperately, I know this changes everything. I know you probably hate me now, but I need you to understand that everything I've done since Margaret's death has been about trying to make amends. Our partnership isn't just about returning your family's land. It's about me trying to become the man Margaret thought I could be. Grace stood up abruptly, the folder clutched in her hands. I need time to think about this, she said, and left the office without another word. That night, Grace walked the fields until dawn, struggling to process what she had learned. The man she had come to respect and trust had built his fortune on the destruction of families just like hers. The partnership she had seen as a symbol of hope and justice was actually the attempt of a guilty man to ease his conscience. But as the sun rose over the land her grandfather had once farmed, Grace began to see the situation differently. Edmund's past was horrific, but his commitment to change seemed genuine. He had given up a multi-million-dollar company, devoted his resources to making amends, and risked his reputation to partner with her. The question was whether redemption was possible for someone who had caused so much harm. Grace returned to the house to find Edmund waiting for her in the kitchen, looking like he hadn't slept at all. Catherine was there too, having apparently been told about the situation during the night. Grace, Edmund said as soon as she entered, I understand if you want to end our partnership. I understand if you never want to see me again. But before you decide, I want you to know that I've already begun reaching out to the families Lancaster Industries harmed. I'm prepared to use my entire fortune, if necessary, to make restitution. Grace looked at him for a long moment, then at Catherine, who was watching the conversation with obvious anxiety. Edmund, Grace said finally, what you did was inexcusable. You destroyed families, communities, dreams. You participated in the same kind of injustice that was done to my grandfather. Edmund nodded, accepting her condemnation. But, Grace continued, what you're doing now, the man you're trying to become, that matters too. The question is whether you're serious about making amends, or whether this partnership is just another way of making yourself feel better. I'm serious, Edmund said immediately. Tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it. Grace thought about her grandfather's journal, about his dream of land that would benefit everyone. She thought about Margaret's courage in confronting Edmund about his business practices. She thought about Emma's drawings of children of all colors working together. I want you to prove it, Grace said. I want you to contact every family that Lancaster Industries harmed. I want you to offer them the same kind of partnership you offered me. I want you to use your wealth and influence to create opportunities for people who have been marginalized, the same way you created opportunities for me. Edmund looked stunned. Grace, that could bankrupt me. Then you'll be bankrupt, Grace replied. The question is whether you're more committed to your money or to justice. Catherine spoke up for the first time. Grace, what you're asking is impossible. Dad can't undo decades of business practices overnight. I'm not asking him to undo anything, Grace said. I'm asking him to dedicate the rest of his life to doing better, to using his privilege to lift up others instead of tearing them down. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, considering Grace's challenge. Then he stood up and walked to his desk. I'll start making phone calls today, he said. And Grace, I want you to oversee the process. I want you to be the one who decides whether each family's situation has been adequately addressed. Grace felt something shift in her understanding of their partnership. She was no longer the recipient of Edmund's generosity. She was the guardian of his redemption. But their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Mitchell entered, her face grave with concern. Grace, Edmund, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to know. James Morrison, that reporter, he's published his story. It's front-page news in 3 states. Grace felt her stomach drop. What does it say? Doctor, Mitchell handed them a newspaper with a headline that made Grace's blood run cold. Billionaire's guilt. Lancaster heir partners with victim's granddaughter in elaborate publicity stunt. The article painted their partnership as a cynical attempt by Edmund to rehabilitate his image after Lancaster Industries' discriminatory practices were exposed. It suggested that Grace was either a willing participant in the deception or a naive victim being manipulated by a master manipulator. But worse than the article itself were the quotes from unnamed sources suggesting that Margaret and Emma's death had not been an accident. and that Edmund's partnership with Grace was somehow connected to the unresolved questions surrounding the crash. Grace read the article twice, feeling her world crumble around her. Everything she had built, everything she had hoped for, was being twisted into something ugly and false. "This will destroy us," Catherine said quietly. "Dad, your reputation will never recover from this." But Edmund was looking at Grace, not at the newspaper. "Grace, do you believe what this article says about me?" Grace studied his face, thinking about everything she had learned about him over the past few months. She thought about his genuine grief for his family, his commitment to their partnership, his willingness to risk everything for justice. "No," she said firmly. "I don't believe it. But Edmund, it doesn't matter what I believe. The damage is done. No one will ever see our partnership as legitimate now." As if to prove her point, the phone began ringing. Edmund answered it to find an angry caller accusing him of fraud. Over the next few hours, the calls multiplied. Angry investors, outraged community members, reporters demanding statements. By evening, protest signs had appeared at the farm's entrance. The local bank called to request a meeting about the farm's loans. 3 major suppliers canceled their contracts, citing the negative publicity. Grace stood at her bedroom window, watching the protesters' torches flicker in the darkness, and wondered if her grandfather's dream was about to die before it had truly begun. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, was being swept away by forces beyond her control. But as she watched the flames outside, Grace made a decision that would determine the rest of her life. She would not be driven away by lies and fear. She would not let Morrison's article destroy what she and Edmund had built together. If the world wanted to see her as a victim or a fraud, that was their choice. But she would continue to fight for justice, no matter what the cost. What Grace didn't know was that the real truth about Margaret and Emma's death was about to surface, and it would challenge everything she thought she understood about courage, forgiveness, and the price of redemption. The next morning brought news that would change everything once again. The police detective who had originally investigated the car accident was coming to the farm, and he had new information about what had really happened on that terrible day 3 years ago. Grace woke to find Edmund already dressed and pacing in the kitchen, his face gray with anxiety. "Detective Reynolds called an hour ago," he said without preamble. "He's reopening the investigation into Margaret and Emma's death." "Why now?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Morrison's article," Edmund replied. "It raised enough questions about possible connections between the accident and my business practices that the police feel obligated to take another look." Catherine arrived shortly after breakfast, having driven through the night from Atlanta after seeing the news coverage. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Dad, this is getting out of control," she said. "Maybe it's time to consider ending the partnership, at least temporarily, until this all blows over." Grace felt a stab of pain at the suggestion, but she understood Catherine's logic. Every day they remained together. The scrutiny intensified. "Catherine's right," Grace said quietly. "Maybe I should leave." "No," Edmund said immediately. "Grace, if you leave now, it will look like an admission of guilt. It will validate everything Morrison wrote about us. And if I stay, it will look like I'm clinging to something I'm not entitled to," Grace replied. Detective Reynolds arrived at noon, a weathered man in his 50s who seemed uncomfortable with the media attention his investigation was attracting. He was accompanied by a younger detective and a woman from the district attorney's office. The interview took place in Edmund's office, with Grace and Catherine present at Edmund's request. Detective Reynolds began by asking Edmund to walk through the events leading up to the accident. Margaret had been researching the families affected by Lancaster Industries, Edmund explained. She had compiled a list of people she wanted to personally apologize to, and properties she thought we should consider returning or providing compensation for. "And she was driving to meet with one of these families on the day of the accident?" Detective Reynolds asked. "Yes, the Morales family. We had acquired their farm 2 years earlier, and Margaret wanted to arrange for them to buy it back at the original sale price." Detective Reynolds made notes, then asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mr. Lancaster, were you aware that your wife had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before her death?" Edmund's face went white. "What?" "We found records of several calls to your home phone that Mrs. Lancaster answered. The calls were traced to burner phones, so we couldn't identify the callers, but according to phone company records, they lasted several minutes each." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of threats?" "We don't know," Detective Reynolds admitted. "Mrs. Lancaster never reported the calls to police, but we do know that she started varying her driving routes and had asked your security company about upgrading the alarm system." Catherine grabbed her father's hand. Dad, did Mom say anything to you about being scared? Edmund shook his head slowly. She seemed worried about something in the last few weeks, but I thought it was just stress about the company situation. She never mentioned any threats. Detective Reynolds continued his questioning for another hour, focusing on the details of Lancaster Industries' business practices and the specific families who had been most vocal in their opposition to the company's methods. Mr. Lancaster, the detective said finally, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe your wife and daughter were murdered? The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Grace saw Edmund's hands begin to shake. I don't know, Edmund whispered. I've wondered, but I tried to convince myself it was just grief talking. The idea that someone killed them because of my business practices, I couldn't bear to think about it. After the police left, the three of them sat in stunned silence. The possibility that Margaret and Emma had been murdered added a horrifying new dimension to an already complex situation. Grace, Edmund said eventually, if Margaret and Emma were killed because of what Lancaster Industries did, then our partnership isn't just about justice for your family. It's about justice for mine too. Grace nodded, understanding what he meant. If the accident had been intentional, then Edmund was as much a victim of his company's practices as the families they had displaced. His wife and daughter had paid the ultimate price for his business decisions. But this revelation also created new dangers. If someone had been willing to kill Margaret and Emma to send a message to Edmund, what might they do to stop his efforts at redemption? That afternoon, Dr. Mitchell came to the farm with news that the situation was escalating beyond their control. Grace, there are rumors that some of the families Lancaster Industries harmed are planning to come to the farm, she said. They want to confront Edmund directly. Are they coming peacefully? Grace asked. I don't know, Dr. Mitchell admitted. But with everything that's happened, emotions are running very high. There's talk of lawsuits, demands for immediate compensation, threats of more protests. Grace realized that their farm was about to become the center of a much larger reckoning with the past. Families who had been hurt by Lancaster Industries would want answers, justice, compensation. The media would turn it into a circus. And somewhere in the chaos, there might still be someone willing to use violence to prevent Edmund from making amends. That evening, Grace made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called a press conference. I want to address Morrison's article directly, she told Edmund and Catherine. I want to tell our story truthfully, before anyone else can twist it. Grace, that's exactly what Morrison wants, Catherine argued. More publicity, more controversy. Maybe, Grace replied, but I'd rather control our own narrative than let others define us. The press conference was held the next day in the farm's main barn. Grace had expected a handful of local reporters, but instead found herself facing cameras from major networks, newspapers from across the South, and a crowd of community members both supportive and hostile. Grace stood at a simple podium Edmund had set up, wearing one of her nicest dresses and the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked out at the crowd, took a deep breath, and began to speak. My name is Grace Washington, she said, her voice clear and strong. I am the granddaughter of Samuel Washington, who owned 40% of what is now Hope Farm until it was taken from him through legal manipulation and racial prejudice in 1947. She paused, letting that sink in. I am also the partner of Edmund Lancaster, whose family unknowingly benefited from that injustice for 3 generations. Grace went on to tell the entire story. Her discovery of the documents, Edmund's response, their decision to form a partnership, and the recent revelations about Lancaster Industries. I want to be clear about something, Grace said, looking directly into the cameras. Mr. Lancaster is not my savior. I am not his redemption project. We are 2 people who discovered that our families' histories are intertwined, and we decided to work together to create something better than what came before. She addressed Morrison's article directly. Some people have suggested that our partnership is a publicity stunt, that I am being manipulated, or that Mr. Lancaster is trying to buy his way out of guilt. I want to tell you what I believe. I believe that people can change. I believe that acknowledging past wrongs is the first step toward creating future rights. And I believe that the land is big enough for all of us, if we have the courage to share it. Grace concluded by announcing that Hope Farm would be establishing a foundation to provide assistance to all families who had been harmed by Lancaster Industries, with oversight from an independent board that would include representatives from affected communities. This is not about charity, Grace said. This is about justice, and justice requires action, not just apologies. The response to Grace's press conference was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with both support and criticism. Community leaders called for calm while activists called for more aggressive action. Some praised Grace's courage while others questioned her naivety. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. That evening, Grace received a phone call from Elena Morales, the daughter of the family Margaret had been driving to meet on the day of the accident. "Miss Washington," Elena said, "I saw your press conference. I think there are things you need to know about what really happened to Mrs. Lancaster and her daughter." Grace's heart began to race. "What kind of things?" "Things my family has been too scared to talk about for 3 years," Elena replied. "But after seeing what you and Mr. Lancaster are trying to do, I think it's time for the truth to come out." Grace arranged to meet Elena the next day, but she had no idea that this conversation would reveal the final, devastating truth about Margaret and Emma's death, and would force her to make the most difficult decision of her life. As she prepared for bed that night, Grace looked out at the fields one more time and wondered if she was strong enough for what was coming. The partnership that had begun as a simple attempt to reclaim her family's land had become something much larger and more dangerous, but there was no turning back now. The truth was demanding to be heard, and Grace had committed herself to seeing it through, no matter where it led. Elena Morales arrived at Hope Farm the next morning, carrying a worn manila envelope that looked like it had been handled countless times. She was a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. Grace met her at the front door, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. "Miss Washington," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly, "what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about Mrs. Lancaster's death." They sat in the library, the same room where Grace had first discovered her family's connection to the land. Edmund and Catherine were present at Elena's request, though she seemed nervous about facing the man whose company had destroyed her family's livelihood. Elena opened the envelope and withdrew a series of photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be official documents. "3 years ago, my family lost our farm to Lancaster Industries," she began. "The methods they used were legal, but morally wrong. They created artificial debt, manipulated property assessments, and used legal technicalities to force a sale at far below market value." Grace had heard similar stories from other families, but Elena's voice carried a weight that suggested there was more to come. "My father, Miguel Morales, was devastated," Elena continued. "He had worked that land for 20 years, built it from nothing into a profitable operation. When Lancaster Industries took it, he lost more than property. He lost his identity, his purpose, his hope." Elena's hands shook as she continued. "Dad started drinking heavily. He talked constantly about getting revenge, about making Mr. Lancaster pay for what he had done. My mother and I tried to get him help, but he was consumed by anger and grief." Grace felt a chill of premonition. "Elena, what did your father do?" Elena looked directly at Edmund, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Lancaster, I am so sorry. My father was the truck driver who hit your wife and daughter." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Catherine gasped. Edmund went completely white, and Grace felt the world tilt around her. "It wasn't an accident," Elena whispered. "Dad had been following Mrs. Lancaster for weeks. He knew her routines, knew when she would be driving to meet with our family. He planned it." Edmund made a sound that was part sob, part roar of anguish. "He murdered them?" "Yes," Elena said, her voice breaking completely. "But Mr. Lancaster, you have to understand that my father wasn't evil. He was a broken man who had lost everything and couldn't see any other way to make the pain stop." Catherine stood up abruptly, her face twisted with rage. "Your father was a murderer. He killed my mother and my 8-year-old sister." "I know," Elena said, not defending but not backing down either. "I know what he did was unforgivable. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm telling you the truth." Grace watched Edmund, who had not spoken since Elena's revelation. His face had gone through a series of emotions, from shock to rage to something that looked like hollow acceptance. "How long have you known?" Edmund asked quietly. "Since the day it happened," Elena replied. "Dad came home covered in blood, talking about how he had evened the score. He died 2 days later from his injuries, but before he died, he confessed everything to me and my mother." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Catherine demanded. Elena looked at her with sad understanding. "Because we were terrified. We were undocumented immigrants who had just lost our home to a powerful white businessman. We thought if we reported what Dad had done, we would be blamed, maybe deported or worse. She pulled out a handwritten letter from the envelope. This is Dad's confession, written in his own hand during his last hours. He wanted Mr. Lancaster to know the truth, but he also wanted to explain why he did it. Edmund took the letter with trembling hands and read it silently. Grace watched his face transform as he absorbed his father-in-law's words. When he finished, he handed the letter to Catherine, who read it with tears streaming down her face. Your father writes that he never intended to hurt Emma, Edmund said eventually. He says she wasn't supposed to be in the car that day. Elena nodded. Dad was supposed to meet Mrs. Lancaster alone. He didn't know about the little girl until it was too late. That's what broke him completely. He said he could live with killing an adult, but knowing he had murdered a child destroyed whatever was left of his soul. Grace felt overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions swirling through the room. The man who had killed Margaret and Emma was the same man whose family had been destroyed by Edmund's business practices. It was a circle of harm that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Elena, Grace said gently, why are you telling us this now? Because of what you said in your press conference, Elena replied. About people being able to change, about working together to create something better. I realized that keeping this secret was just perpetuating the cycle of pain. Elena reached into the envelope one more time and withdrew a thick bundle of documents. These are the records Dad kept of everything Lancaster Industries did to our family and others. He was obsessed with documenting every injustice, every manipulation. He thought someday he would use them to expose Mr. Lancaster. She handed the documents to Grace. I want you to have them. Use them to help the other families, to make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else. Grace looked through the documents and realized that Miguel Morales had compiled the most comprehensive record of Lancaster Industries' discriminatory practices that she had ever seen. The evidence was damning and detailed, showing a pattern of deliberate targeting of minority communities. Elena, Edmund said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I don't know how to respond to this. Part of me wants to hate your father for what he took from me. But another part of me understands that I created the circumstances that drove him to such desperation. Elena looked at him with surprise. You're not angry? I am angry, Edmund replied. I'm furious. But I'm angry at myself as much as at your father. If I hadn't built my business on the suffering of families like yours, Margaret and Emma would still be alive. Catherine, who had been silent since reading Miguel's confession, suddenly spoke up. This doesn't change anything, she said, her voice cold. A murderer is still a murderer, regardless of his motivations. Catherine's right, Grace said quietly. Nothing justifies what your father did, Elena. But understanding why it happened might help us prevent similar tragedies in the future. Elena nodded. That's why I came forward. I can't bring back Mrs. Lancaster and Emma, but maybe their deaths can have meaning if they help break the cycle of violence and revenge. The conversation continued for several more hours, with Elena providing details about other families who had been affected by Lancaster Industries, and about the community's reaction to the partnership between Grace and Edmund. Some saw it as genuine progress, while others viewed it with suspicion or resentment. When Elena finally left, the three of them sat in stunned silence. The truth about Margaret and Emma's death had provided answers, but it had also raised new questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. That evening, Grace found Edmund sitting alone in Emma's room, surrounded by his daughter's drawings of the farm. He was holding one particular picture, a crayon drawing of stick figures of different colors holding hands in a field of flowers. She drew this a week before she died, Edmund said without looking up. She called it the day everyone gets along. Grace sat beside him on Emma's small bed. Edmund, I know this is incredibly painful, but I need to ask you something. Does learning the truth about the accident change how you feel about our partnership? Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's artwork. Grace, for 3 years I've been consumed by guilt about Margaret and Emma's death. I thought if I could just do enough good, make enough amends, somehow it would balance the scales. He set the drawing aside and looked at Grace directly. But now I understand that redemption doesn't work that way. I can't bring them back by helping other people. I can't earn forgiveness by giving away money. Grace felt her heart sink, wondering if he was about to end their partnership. But, Edmund continued, I can honor their memory by becoming the man Margaret believed I could be. And Emma's dream of a place where everyone gets along, that's worth fighting for regardless of whether it redeems me personally. Grace felt tears of relief and admiration. So what do we do now? We continue, Edmund said firmly. We expand the foundation. We help every family we can find, and we turn this farm into the kind of place Emma dreamed about. Over the following weeks, news of Elena's revelation sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. The story of Miguel Morales, the broken farmer who had murdered a mother and child in revenge for losing his land, became a powerful symbol of how injustice could perpetuate cycles of violence. Some people used the story to justify their opposition to Grace and Edmund's partnership, arguing that it proved the dangers of challenging established social orders. Others saw it as validation of the need for systemic change to address historical injustices. Detective Reynolds concluded his investigation by ruling Margaret and Emma's deaths as homicides, though obviously no charges could be filed against the dead Miguel Morales. The case was officially closed, but its emotional impact continued to reverberate. Grace found herself struggling with conflicting emotions about Miguel Morales. She understood the desperation that had driven him to violence, but she couldn't condone what he had done. She grieved for Margaret and Emma, but she also grieved for Miguel and his family, who had been destroyed by the same system that had benefited the Lancasters for generations. It was Dr. Mitchell who helped Grace find a framework for understanding these complex feelings. "Grace," she said during one of their conversations, "justice isn't about choosing sides between victims. It's about creating systems that prevent people from becoming victims in the first place." This perspective became the guiding principle for the foundation that Grace and Edmund established. Rather than simply providing financial compensation to families harmed by Lancaster Industries, they created programs designed to address the root causes of economic inequality and racial discrimination. They established scholarship programs for students from communities affected by discriminatory business practices. They created small business loan programs with favorable terms for minority entrepreneurs. They funded legal aid services to help families fight predatory lending and fraudulent property transactions. Most importantly, they used Hope Farm itself as a model for sustainable, community-based agriculture that provided opportunities for people of all backgrounds. The transformation was not easy or fast. There were setbacks, conflicts, and moments when Grace wondered if they were really making a difference. Some of the families they tried to help were suspicious of their motives. Some community members continued to oppose their efforts. Some days, the weight of history and expectation felt overwhelming. But there were also victories. The first scholarship recipients graduated from college and returned to their communities as teachers, nurses, and business owners. Several families were able to buy back properties that had been taken from them. The farm's community-supported agriculture program created connections between urban and rural families across racial and economic lines. 1 year after Elena's revelation, Grace stood in the same fields where her grandfather had once worked, watching children from the local elementary school learn about sustainable farming. The group included white children, black children, Hispanic children, and children from other backgrounds, all working together to plant seeds that would grow into food for their community. Catherine, who had initially been skeptical of the school program, was now one of its most enthusiastic supporters. She had taken a leave of absence from her law firm to help manage the foundation's legal affairs, and Grace could see how the work was helping her process her grief over losing Margaret and Emma. "You know," Catherine said, joining Grace at the edge of the field, "I think Emma would have loved this." Grace nodded, remembering the drawing of children of different colors holding hands. "I think your mother would have loved it too." "Grace," Catherine said, "I need to tell you something I should have said months ago. When I first met you, I thought you were taking advantage of my father's grief. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." "You were protecting your family," Grace replied. "I understand that." "No, it was more than that," Catherine insisted. "I was scared that if Dad cared about you and your dreams, it would somehow diminish his love for Mom and Emma. But I've learned that love doesn't work that way. Caring about your family's legacy doesn't take anything away from mine." That evening, Grace, Edmund, and Catherine gathered in the main house for their weekly planning meeting. The foundation had grown beyond anything they had originally envisioned, with programs in 3 states and partnerships with dozens of community organizations. "I've been thinking about our long-term goals," Edmund said, reviewing a stack of reports. "We've made good progress in addressing the specific harms caused by Lancaster Industries, but there are so many other families and communities that need support." "What are you suggesting?" Grace asked. "I'm suggesting we think bigger," Edmund replied. "What if Hope Farm became the headquarters for a national movement? What if we used our success here as a model for similar partnerships in other places?" Grace felt a familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety. The idea was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, But she had learned not to underestimate what was possible when people committed themselves to justice. It would require significant resources, Catherine noted, and we'd need to find other partners who share our vision. I think we can find them, Grace said, thinking about the letters and phone calls they had received from around the country. There are people everywhere who are tired of the way things have always been and ready to work for something better. They spent the rest of the evening planning, dreaming, and arguing about the details of their vision. Grace watched Edmund and Catherine work together, seeing how their shared commitment to honor Margaret and Emma's memory had brought them closer than they had been since the accident. Later that night, Grace walked alone through the orchard, thinking about how much her life had changed. 2 years earlier, she had been an invisible domestic worker with no hope for the future. Now she was a landowner, a foundation director, and a symbol of possibility for people across the country. But more importantly, she had learned that her worth was not determined by other people's recognition. She belonged on this land not because Edmund had welcomed her, but because it was her birthright. She deserved respect, not because she had proven herself exceptional, but because she was human. As she walked, Grace heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Edmund approaching with a small wooden box in his hands. "Grace," he said, "I have something that belongs to you." He handed her the box, which was old and worn, with intricate carvings on its surface. Grace opened it to find her grandfather's pocket watch, the one she remembered him carrying when she was a child. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "It was in the safe in my grandfather's study," Edmund replied. "According to a note I found with it, your grandfather gave it to mine as collateral for a loan that was supposed to help him keep the farm. My grandfather kept it even after the land was sold." Grace held the watch carefully, feeling the weight of generations in her hands. "Edmund, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Edmund replied. "Just know that your grandfather's dream didn't die when he lost this land. It's living again, stronger than ever." Grace wound the watch and was amazed to hear it still ticking, as if it had been waiting all these years to be returned to its rightful owner. The next morning brought news that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their story. Dr. Mitchell arrived at the farm with a delegation from the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and several other civil rights organizations. "Grace, Edmund," Dr. Mitchell said, "we want to propose a partnership that could expand your work nationally. We think Hope Farm could become the center of a new movement for restorative justice and economic equality." The proposal was ambitious: a network of farms, community centers, and educational programs that would address historical injustices while creating economic opportunities for marginalized communities. Hope Farm would serve as the model and training center, with Grace and Edmund sharing their experience with other communities, seeking to address their own histories of discrimination. "It's a beautiful vision," Grace said after hearing the proposal. "But are we ready for something this big?" "Grace," said Maria Santos, the NAACP representative, "you may not feel ready, but the country needs what you've built here. We have communities across the South that have been asking for help in addressing similar issues. Your success proves that reconciliation and justice are possible." Edmund listened quietly to the presentation, then asked the question that Grace had been thinking: "What would be required of us personally?" "Leadership," replied David Chen from the Southern Poverty Law Center. "You would need to travel, speak publicly, train other communities, and serve as the face of this movement." Grace felt overwhelmed by the prospect. She had never imagined herself as a public figure or movement leader, but she thought about all the families still struggling with the legacy of discrimination, all the communities that could benefit from what they had learned at Hope Farm. "I'll do it," Grace said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "But only if we maintain control over our message and methods. This can't become about politics or publicity. It has to remain focused on real change for real people." Edmund nodded his agreement. "And we need guarantees that Hope Farm will always remain a working farm, not just a symbol. The land has to continue serving its original purpose." Over the following months, the Hope Farm model began expanding to other communities. Grace found herself traveling across the South, meeting with families who had experienced discrimination, speaking at universities and conferences, and working with local leaders to adapt their approach to different circumstances. Each community was different, with its own history and challenges. But Grace discovered that the core principles remained the same: acknowledging past wrongs, creating opportunities for partnership, and focusing on practical solutions that benefited everyone involved. In Mississippi, they helped establish a cooperative farm owned by both Black and white families, whose land had been lost to discriminatory lending practices. In Alabama, They created a scholarship program for students from communities affected by environmental racism. In Georgia, they helped develop a community-owned business district that provided economic opportunities while preserving local history. Not every effort was successful. Some communities were too divided by historical animosity to work together. Some politicians and business leaders actively opposed their efforts. Some families were too damaged by past trauma to trust any offers of reconciliation. But for every failure, there were multiple successes. Grace began receiving letters from young people who said Hope Farm had inspired them to pursue careers in social justice. Business leaders started adopting more equitable practices after learning about their model. Communities that had been divided for generations began finding ways to work together. One particularly meaningful moment came when Grace was invited to speak at a conference for domestic workers in Chicago. Standing before an audience of hundreds of women who cleaned houses, cared for children, and maintained homes for other people, Grace saw her own story reflected in their faces. "I'm not here to tell you that if you work hard enough, you'll become a landowner," Grace said. "I'm here to tell you that you already deserve dignity, respect, and opportunity, regardless of what work you do or where you come from." She talked about her own experience of invisible labor, of being seen as less than human, of believing that she had to accept whatever scraps society offered her. "But I want you to know," Grace continued, "that your worth is not determined by other people's recognition. You belong in every room you enter. You deserve to be heard, to be valued, and to have your dreams taken seriously." The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes. But what moved Grace most were the individual conversations afterward, with women who shared their own stories of struggle and perseverance. "Miss Washington," said an elderly Latina woman named Carmen, "you give me hope that things can be different for my granddaughter." That sentiment, repeated in countless variations, became the fuel that sustained Grace through the challenges of her new role as a public figure. Back at Hope Farm, the changes continued. The property now included a conference center where other communities could come to learn about restorative justice practices. The farm's produce was sold at markets throughout the region, with profits supporting the foundation's work. A documentary crew was filming a movie about their story, though Grace insisted that the focus remain on the lessons rather than the personalities involved. Most importantly, the partnership between Grace and Edmund had evolved into something deeper than either had originally envisioned. They were no longer just business partners or even friends. They had become family, bound together by shared commitment to justice and mutual respect earned through struggle. 3 years after that first letter Grace had written from her boarding house room, she stood once again in the main hall of Hope Farm. But this time, the elegant crowd gathered there included people of all colors and backgrounds, united not by wealth or status, but by shared commitment to creating a better world. The occasion was the dedication of the Margaret and Emma Lancaster Memorial Library, a new building on the farm's property that would serve as a resource center for communities working on restorative justice projects. Catherine had designed the library as a tribute to her mother and sister, incorporating elements from Emma's drawings and Margaret's favorite books. As Grace looked around the room, she saw faces that told the story of their journey. Elena Morales was there with her own children, who played freely with other kids from the community. Dr. Mitchell was talking with representatives from foundations that were funding similar projects in other states. Timothy Collins, their first employee, was now managing agricultural programs for the entire network of affiliated farms. Edmund stood beside Grace, looking healthier and more at peace than she had ever seen him. The burden of guilt that had weighed on him for years had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into purpose. "Grace," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't written that letter?" Grace thought about the question. "I think somehow we would have found each other anyway. I think the land itself demanded that we work together to heal what had been broken." Catherine approached them, carrying a small wrapped package. "Grace, this is from the children at the elementary school. They wanted to give you something for the dedication." Grace unwrapped the package to find a collection of drawings, similar to Emma's artwork, but created by the current generation of children who visited the farm. The pictures showed the same vision of people of different colors working together, but they also included new elements: solar panels, wind turbines, and other symbols of the sustainable future they were building together. "They wanted you to know," Catherine said, "that they understand what this place represents. Their teacher told them about your grandfather's dreams and how you made them come true." Grace felt tears coming to her eyes as she looked at the artwork. These children, unlike the generations before them, were growing up believing that cooperation across racial and economic lines was normal and expected. As the evening's formal program began, Grace was asked to speak about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd, and thought about all the people who had contributed to this moment. Her grandfather Samuel, whose dreams had sustained her through everything. Margaret and Emma, whose deaths had catalyzed Edmund's transformation. Miguel Morales, whose desperate act had revealed the true cost of injustice. And countless others whose stories of pain and perseverance had shaped their work. When I first came to this farm, Grace began, I thought I was looking for a place to belong. What I found was that I had always belonged here. This land was part of me before I was even born. She talked about the power of acknowledging truth, even when it was painful. About the possibility of redemption, even for those who had caused great harm. About the importance of creating systems that prevented injustice rather than just responding to it after the fact. But most importantly, Grace said, I learned that justice is not something that happens to us. It's something we create together, through the choices we make every day about how we treat each other. Grace concluded her speech by reading from her grandfather's journal, sharing his words about the land feeding families of all colors and children, learning together under the shade of trees. Samuel Washington's dream didn't die when this land was taken from him, Grace said. It just waited patiently for the right moment to bloom again. Today, as we dedicate this library to Margaret and Emma Lancaster, we're planting seeds for dreams that our children and grandchildren will harvest. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and children played in the library's reading garden, Grace found herself standing alone at the edge of the fields where her grandfather had once worked. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the first evening she had walked these fields with Edmund. Edmund joined her, as she had known he would. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade over the land that had brought them together. Grace, Edmund said finally, I have one more thing that belongs to you. He handed her a deed, freshly signed and notarized. Grace read it with growing amazement. It was the title to her original family home in the city, the small house where she had grown up before her family lost everything. Edmund had quietly purchased it and restored it, and now he was transferring ownership back to her. Edmund, how did you even find this place? Catherine helped me track it down, he replied. We thought you might want to have it back, not to live in necessarily, but as a reminder that home is wherever your family's love lives. Grace looked at the deed, then at Edmund's face, which showed the same mixture of hope and uncertainty she had seen that first day they met. Thank you, she said simply. But Edmund, you know that this farm is my home now, right? Whatever happens in the future, wherever our work takes us, this will always be home. Edmund smiled, the deep, genuine smile that had become familiar over their years of partnership. I was hoping you'd say that. As they walked back toward the house, where the lights were beginning to come on, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the evening air. Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a woman fleeing injustice and searching for dignity. She had become a landowner, a community leader, and a symbol of possibility for people across the country. But more than any of those roles, she had become someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to demand that others recognize it too. She had learned that belonging wasn't something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something she could claim for herself. 5 years later, Grace Washington stood before the United States Congress, invited to testify about legislation that would provide federal support for community-based restorative justice programs. She wore a simple black dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace, and she carried with her the pocket watch that had once belonged to her grandfather. The committee room was packed with representatives, senators, advocates, and media members. Grace looked out at the crowd and saw faces that reflected the diversity of the country she was addressing. Honorable members of Congress, Grace began. I come before you today not as an expert or academic, but as someone who has lived the reality of historical injustice and witnessed the power of restorative partnerships. She told the story of Hope Farm simply and directly, focusing on the practical results rather than the emotional drama. She presented data on economic outcomes, educational achievements, and community reconciliation measures. She answered questions about scalability, sustainability, and cost-effectiveness. But when Senator Patricia Williams from Georgia asked about the personal toll of the work, Grace's response revealed the deeper truth of her journey. Senator Williams, this work is not easy. There are days when the weight of history feels overwhelming. There are moments when the resistance to change seems insurmountable. But I have learned that the alternative to fighting for justice is accepting injustice. And that is not an option for people like me. She paused, thinking about all the faces she had seen over the years. Children learning to read in the Margaret and Emma Memorial Library. Families reclaiming land that had been stolen from their grandparents. Young people graduating from college with scholarships funded by restorative justice programs. The question is not whether this work is difficult, Grace continued. The question is whether we have the courage to do what is right, even when it is hard. The legislation passed 6 months later, providing federal funding for community-based programs that addressed historical injustices through partnership and restoration, rather than litigation and punishment. Hope Farm became one of the first recipients of the grants, allowing them to expand their work to communities across the country. But for Grace, the most meaningful recognition came not from Congress or the media, but from a letter she received from a young girl named Sarah Washington, who claimed to be her cousin's granddaughter. "Dear Miss Grace," the letter read in careful handwriting, "my teacher told us about you, and how you got back our family's land. I want you to know that I'm going to work hard in school, and maybe someday I can help families like you helped families. My grandma says that you made it possible for little girls like me to dream big dreams." Grace read the letter 3 times, then carefully placed it in the same box where she kept her grandfather's journal and watch. These were the treasures that mattered, the evidence that her story had become part of a larger narrative of hope and possibility. 10 years after that first nervous day when she had arrived at Hope Farm with a worn suitcase and trembling hands, Grace Washington sat in the rocking chair on the front porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the fields gold. Beside her sat Edmund Lancaster, now in his 70s but still passionate about their work. On the porch steps, Catherine's twins played with blocks, building structures they claimed would be libraries and farms and schools. "Aunt Grace," said 4-year-old Emma Lancaster Collins, named for the sister Catherine had lost, "tell us the story about the land." Grace smiled, recognizing the request that had become a weekly tradition. She began the story the way she always did. Once upon a time, there was a man who loved the land so much that he dreamed it would feed children of every color. As Grace told the familiar story, weaving together her grandfather's dreams, Margaret's courage, and the partnership that had transformed both their families, she realized that she was no longer just recounting the past. She was speaking their future into existence, ensuring that the next generation would understand both the pain and the possibility that had brought them to this moment. When the story ended, as it always did, with the land finally fulfilling its promise to welcome everyone, little Emma asked the question she asked every time, "And they all lived happily ever after?" Grace looked out at the fields where tomorrow's harvest was growing, at the memorial library where children from across the county came to learn, at the conference center where communities came to discover their own paths to healing. She thought about the network of farms and programs that now stretched across 12 states, touching thousands of lives and creating opportunities that hadn't existed before. "They lived hopefully ever after," Grace replied, using the ending she had crafted specifically for these stories. "Because they learned that happiness isn't something that just happens to you. It's something you build day by day, by choosing to treat each other with justice and love." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible domestic worker to nationally recognized leader. But more importantly, she thought about the journey still ahead, the communities yet to be reached, the injustices yet to be addressed, the partnerships yet to be forged. She had learned that redemption was possible, but it required honest acknowledgement of harm done and sustained commitment to doing better. She had learned that forgiveness was powerful, but it didn't mean forgetting or excusing injustice. She had learned that change was possible, but it demanded courage from people willing to risk everything for what was right. As Grace rocked gently in her chair, listening to the night sounds of the farm and feeling the deep contentment of work well done and love freely given, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to all those who had made this moment possible. Her grandfather Samuel, whose dreams had never died. Margaret and Emma, whose deaths had catalyzed transformation. Miguel Morales, whose broken heart had taught them about the cost of injustice. And Edmund, whose courage to change had made redemption real. Most of all, she had learned that the land really was big enough for everyone, as long as people had the wisdom to share it and the strength to defend each other's right to belong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new people seeking hope in a world that often seemed designed to crush dreams. But tonight, Grace Washington sat in peace on land that belonged to her, not because someone had granted her permission, but because she had claimed her birthright with dignity and defended it with love. The fields stretched out before her in the moonlight, ready for tomorrow's planting, tomorrow's harvest, tomorrow's dreams. And Grace knew, with the certainty that comes from having walked through fire and emerged stronger, that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with her head held high and her heart open to the possibilities that bloomed when justice and love worked hand in hand. The land was finally home to everyone who tended it with respect. Her grandfather's dream lived on in every seed planted, every child educated, every partnership forged across the lines that had once seemed impossible to cross. And in that fulfillment, Grace Washington found the deepest peace of all, the knowledge that her life had mattered, that her story had become part of something larger and more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine.